L'Assemblée va entendre.
The Assembly will now hear a statement by His Excellency, Mr. Sebastián Echeñique, President of the Republic of Chile. I would request protocol to please escort His Excellency.
Au nom de l'Assemblée Générale,
on behalf of the General Assembly, it is my honor to welcome to the United Nations His Excellency Sebastián Piñera Echeñique, President of the Republic of Chile. And I invite him to now address the Assembly.
Señor Presidente.
Good morning, Madam President, Mr. Secretary General, heads of state and government, ladies and gentlemen. 20 years ago, in this very same hall, Kofi Annan defined the three great challenges facing the international community at that time. The first was the challenge of security, replacing the Cold War order that had prevailed until the end of the Cold War by a new order governed by peace and freedom. Second, the challenge of development, ensuring that globalization benefits everyone and all countries, all people, and leaves no one behind. Third, the challenge of human rights and the rule of law, protecting the dignity of all without distinction as to race, color, gender, language, or any other form of discrimination. 2 decades have elapsed since then, and the challenges set forth by Kofi Annan, security, development, human rights, and the rule of law. And they continue to be as important now as they were then. And they continue to be central to our world order. Of course, these challenges look different today, and they take on new forms. We are no longer divided by mistrust, fear, and prejudice left by the Iron Curtains and iron walls after the end of the Second World War. It's true that there is much that unites us with respect to human dignity and freedoms, and we are connected by an information-based and knowledge-based society, which has been generous with those countries that have it, but also with those countries that are working towards it. We are living at a time of huge global transformations, creating major new dangers, but also amazing new opportunities. Many people believe that the end of the Cold War also meant the end of history, and that we had at last found our way, and we were approaching an era of peace, freedom, and prosperity, based on democracy and the social market economy. However, history will never reach an end as long as there is a man or woman who is free and able to think for him or herself. And thus we have a new international world order, which has given rise to new tensions in many parts of the world. And today, states are no longer the only players on the international stage. In the area of security, we have not yet been able to deal with serious threats to international peace and security, such as terrorism, drug trafficking, armed conflicts, transnational organized crime, the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, or illicit trafficking in weapons and persons. Moreover, today we are called upon to tackle, like never before in history, one of the greatest challenges ever, which stems from these threats to peace and security, and that is the great challenge of large-scale migration that we are seeing in our world. These massive, large-scale migrations are a challenge for the entire international community. And we know the root causes of it: terrorism, war, hunger, and totalitarian regimes, all of which have caused, in recent times, the largest cross-border displacement of people in the history of mankind. The figures speak for themselves eloquently and are impressive. There are currently 258 million migrants throughout the world. Every year, more than 1.3 million people leave their countries of origin. Given this situation, my country's commitment, Chile's commitment, is clear and categorical. We are developing a migration policy that will be secure, orderly, and regular. And this reflects the spirit both of the New York Declaration and the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration, which are based on migratory processes that would be secure, orderly, and regular. We want to receive and welcome all those who come to Chile in quest of a better life, who will respect our laws, who commit to the development of our country, who contribute to it, and who integrate into our society. But also, with the same strength of conviction, we wish to put our house in order and have the income of those who work legally, not those who don't respect our laws or who commit crimes or who have committed grave crimes in their country of origin. We need to make a distinction. And this is how we need to stop the coming in of drug traffickers or organized criminals. And it's the responsibility of all presidents or heads of state and government to take action, and no doubt this is of concern to all governments. Our migratory policy seeks to strike a balance between the sovereign right of the state to regulate the manner in which foreigners enter and remain in our country with respect for and guarantees of the fundamental rights and duties of migrants, putting a stop to irregular immigration and halting criminal activities at our borders, and rather welcoming those who come into our societies legally and who obey our laws and contribute to our societies. The next challenge is development. 6 months ago, when I embarked on my second term as President of Chile, we pledged to undertake a great mission to transform Chile into a developed country without poverty, with greater justice and equality of opportunity by the end of the next decade. Because true development, genuine development, is much more than economic growth. That's why we talk about comprehensive development that would be inclusive and sustainable and cover all aspects of human development that include people, families, and regions. Sustainable development that would take care of our environment, that would provide for living in harmony with our environment and nature. That is genuine development that we need for all peoples around the world, and that we, almost all of us, have ratified through our commitment to the Sustainable Development, Millennium Development Goals in the past, and now the 17 Sustainable Development Goals and the 2030 Agenda now, which we are committed to today under the auspices of the United Nations. For this reason, the defense and strengthening of multilateralism and free trade, to which many have alluded this week, has great threats to tackle. That it would include trade wars, tariff wars, and we know the impact of these wars. We saw what happened with the Great Depression of the last century. The economic dimension is, of course, very important. We need to promote and strengthen, more than ever, a rules-based international system that is predictable, based on clear rules, agreed rules for trade, predictable rules, and that would allow for the existence of mechanisms for the peaceful settlement of disputes, and not through conflict or confrontations or tariff wars. But we must also concern ourselves with creating a culture and an international community which would be built on the basis of principles and values. Values such as protection of human dignity, full respect for human rights, gender equality, measures to combat climate change, and measures taken in order to grapple with new threats that we are facing today, such as cybersecurity. This comprehensive, inclusive, and sustainable development oblige us to energetically implement measures in order to fully bring about gender equality, dignity, and opportunities among men and women, as well as zero tolerance, a culture which is a zero tolerance culture for any kind of violence or discrimination against women. True development for our societies can be measured by the way in which we treat our most vulnerable members, children, women, older persons, the ill, and the most poor amongst us. And in many areas, in many of our countries, there is still a long path ahead. Today, our planet faces major threats and challenges, such as the deterioration of the environment, global warming, increasing desertification, destruction of the ozone layer, depletion of natural resources, the loss of biodiversity, pollution of air, water, soil, destruction of forests, and much more. Some time ago, we saw headlines in prestigious newspapers and magazines reading titles such as "Save Planet Earth." However, the truth is that's not the main concern. Planet Earth has existed for more than 4,000 years and dealt with all types of disasters such as floods, heating, earthquakes, glaciers. What's really the problem, what's really the threat, is the existence of human beings on the planet. Because throughout this long history, 99 out of every 100 species which at some point in time existed today no longer exist. And no doubt we do not want to see the human species be added to that sad list of extinct species. And we know that the environment is changing and the climate is warming faster than our understanding or ability to understand, protect it, and stop it. And even though the alarms have been sounded and continue to be sounded, our citizens continue to march forward, and we cannot not listen to them. We have a duty to respond today to the screams of nature that are asking us to protect it so that nature in turn can protect us. And there's no more time. We have no time to lose, no time to vacillate, because nature has gone from being an ally to becoming an enemy. Ladies and gentlemen, our generation's response to this great challenge will clearly and undoubtedly be judged by our children and by our grandchildren and by history, because the threat of climate change will define the shape of this century and centuries to come. And it requires deep-seated multilateral efforts. We know that it is a serious, urgent, and growing threat, and we can no longer ignore it or minimize it or postpone it. No generation is immune to this threat, but Chile is especially vulnerable to this threat. My country is a veritable observatory and natural laboratory. It has a diversity of land, maritime, coastal, glacial, river, lake, coastal, wetland, and island ecosystems that are unique in the world. They contain a total of 30,000 species of plants, animal, fungi, and bacteria. In addition, because of its geographical location, Chile has unique natural barriers, such as the Andes Range in the east, the Pacific Ocean in the west, the Atacama Desert in the north, and Antarctica in the south. What that means is that there are species that are found only in our country, Chile. For example, on the Robinson Crusoe Island in the Juan Fernandez archipelago, almost 90% of the fish species are endemic. In other words, they only exist in that environment. That is the highest percentage in the world. And yet, our greatest advantage is also our disadvantage. This natural observatory of Chile is very exposed to climate change and global warming and the ensuing consequences. Thus, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change lists 9 major vulnerability factors, of which 7 apply to Chile. And they include low-lying coastal areas, arid and semi-arid areas, forested areas, areas prone to natural disasters, areas liable to drought and desertification, urban areas with atmospheric pollution problems, and mountainous ecosystems. This means that we must push to seek solutions that are effective in order to survive and to grapple with global warming, flooding, drought, and earthquakes. As President of Chile, I am committed to development that is sustainable. In other words, respectful of nature and of the environment. The threat, which once was very distant, is now upon us. And we can bear witness to the lethal impact that these changes may have on the present and future generations. And in this area, there's no time to waste. The time has come to react and take the bull by the horns to change history and ensure the future. What have we done in Chile? First, we are committed to the creation of protected areas which we believe are crucial to biodiversity conservation. Chile has been a regional and world leader in the formation of protected areas ever since the last century, with the Mayeco National Reserve, which was created in 1907. There are today 180 protected areas in Chile, 40 marine areas and 140 land areas, covering some 10 million hectares. Second, we are firmly committed to the conservation of the oceans, their biodiversity, and the sustainable use of their resources. We have already protected more than 13% of our exclusive economic zone and shall soon cover 40%. Moreover, we are on a path to achieving this 40%. Chile has the largest marine protected area in Latin America, in the world, which is as the marvelous island of Easter Island and Rapa Nui. Third, we have an energy route designed to achieve a clean, safe, and more cost-effective and diversified matrix that strongly promotes decarbonization. It's not been possible to develop clean, renewable energy sources substantially, especially those related to using the energy of volcanoes. Chile has 25% of active volcanoes in the world. Wind and solar energy, since we also have the highest level of radiation in the world with our deserts. We're also making decisive progress in the area of removing fossil fuels from our transportation system and using electricity as a more definitive solution and more compatible with our goals. We are also tackling the threat of plastic for our country. We have understood the importance of all governments taking action in time to avert the path that we're on, which is some 12,000 million tons of plastic waste in nature. That means there will be more plastic bags in the oceans than fish if we continue on the path that we're on. And so I am very proud that the first legislation that my government adopted was to ban the use of plastic bags in our shops. Chile is the first country in Latin America to restrict the free distribution of any kind of single-use plastic bag. And indeed, a plastic bag takes seconds to produce It's used on average for 30 minutes in transition from the grocery store to the home, and then it takes 400 years to biodegrade. In other words, for a few minutes of use, nature and mankind suffer the harmful effects of a plastic bag for over 400 years. We must abandon old ideas and take on new attitudes that economic growth and protection of the environment are incompatible objectives. Indeed, sustainable development is our lodestar. We want to abandon the throwaway culture, and we want to embrace, once again, the recyclable culture. Pollution has, in fact, struck very close to home in my country in a very dramatic way. In recent weeks, 2 communes in Chile, Punchucaví and Quinteros communes, are in an area that has long been saturated with pollution, experienced a serious episode of environmental pollution, which impacted the health of many of our compatriots. Given the gravity of the situation, I immediately went to visit the affected zone and stand in unity with the local authorities, and to see with my own eyes the dramatic impact of this disaster, which was significant. And on that day, we ratified a commitment to our compatriots, and that was to change the history of these 2 areas. And so we put in place a plan to manage the emergency and to manage the health of the inhabitants, but also to find a definitive solution to the problem, to better protect the quality of the water, the air, and the soil. And this would be done through ongoing monitoring and the best technological standards available, with extraordinary standards in the area of emissions set for polluting companies, and a complete decontamination plan that will help us contain the situation and find a definitive solution that would put an end to what our country has called sacrifice zones. We know that nature is not something that we've just received from our parents as a heritage and that we can do with as we will. We understand that it's a loan and that we will then have to give it to our children and grandchildren. We must take care of it and return it in improved condition. And this is a challenge that must involve all players in society. In order to efficiently channel this collective and multi-sectoral effort, we must all be committed. And here we see the importance of the framework law on climate change being promoted in our country. The goal is clear: to reduce our greenhouse gases emissions by 20% by the year 2030. And in order to do so, we must incorporate the climate change perspective in all public policies, government policies and plans and instruments, as well as in those of the private sector. In fact, we're doing this through inclusion of environmental policy and climate change policy in our national systems of investments, in the system of public expenditure, and in the evaluation of environmental impact. We are also including these concerns and commitments in all of our trade agreements. We have environmental provisions, both bilateral and multilateral agreements. One example would be the CPTPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which includes 11 countries on both sides of the immense Pacific Ocean. We also see it reflected in the way in which we have incorporated associated states in the Pacific Alliance. I am sure that these developments will significantly reduce our carbon emissions, while at the same time making our economies grow. Because the challenge is very demanding, but it also requires a great deal of determination. It also requires ambition. But we have 2 great allies. The first is technology. Today, imagination, innovation, scientific advances technology, all the result of productivity and creativity of men and women, have provided us with tools that we didn't have in the past so that we can avoid this serious threat. And that's why we need to continue driving forward our scientific and technological entrepreneurs so that we can continue with this battle and not repeat the errors of the past. In recent days, we saw an initiative put in place to more effectively collect the garbage and the plastic bags from our oceans. And we're using that technology in our country in order to fulfill our commitments in this area. We also have the multilateral system, which invites us to act in a coordinated manner. This is precisely the goal of the Sustainable Development Goals. And yet we also know that many times bureaucracy can slow down the work of the United Nations. And that's why we must improve coordination. We must be able to improve delivery and accountability and provide closer coordination. We need to focus more on results and less on process. As a great United States president once remarked, we are the first generation to feel the impact of climate change. We're also the last generation that can do something about it. I would now like to turn to the area of human rights and the rule of law, which is the third challenge put forth by Kofi Annan in this very hall. Human rights, the rule of law, and democracy, as well as freedom. The last time I stood at this podium was 5 years ago. At that time, I was able to share with the General Assembly the lessons that we Chileans have learned 40 years after its democracy was interrupted. The lessons about the collapse of democracy and about the transition back to democracy. They're categorical. The first and most important lesson is that there are moral and legal norms that should always be respected by everyone. Combatants and non-combatants, civilians and soldiers, leaders and subordinates. Atrocities such as torture, crimes against humanity, terrorism, political assassination, and forced disappearance of persons are actions that can never be justified in any context, in any circumstance, in any time, in any place. Freedom, democracy, peace, and civic amity are values which are much more fragile than we might have thought, which means that we must never take them for granted. They need to always be valued, taught, and protected, and promoted, because these values are like breathing. When we have air, we don't miss it, but when we can't breathe, sometimes it's too late to get the air back. Today, in Chile, we're just a few days away from the 30 years since the referendum held on the 5th of October that opened the path to recovery of democracy in Chile. And I'd like to take this opportunity to speak about two major transitions that our generation had to face in Chile. The first was the transition from an authoritarian government to a democratic government. We did so in an intelligent and exemplary manner. Normally, such transitions take place amid political crisis, economic chaos, and social violence. But none of this happened in Italy. We were able to recover our democracy and our freedoms in an exemplary manner. But that is a transition which is now in part of our history. The new transition, our transition, which depends on us, which is currently underway, is to transform Chile, which was the poorest colony of Latin America when it was a colony of Spain, to transform it into a developed country without poverty, with greater justice and equal opportunities, into a country in which we can all develop our talents and life projects, enjoy a fuller and happier life before the end of the next decade. And this transformation, we must do it with the same intelligence and in the same exemplary manner in which we did to recover our democracy. Today, I want to state clearly and forcefully that human rights, democracy, and freedom cannot be ignored, and that's why I want this General Assembly to hear the voice of the Venezuelan people, whom President Maduro has left voiceless. Venezuela is a sister nation, which for decades was a democracy that sought great progress and which also generously opened its borders so that many Latin Americans could go there and find work, opportunities that were not available in their own lands. Unfortunately, today, Venezuela is governed by a regime that does not respect any of those principles, neither freedom, nor democracy, nor human rights. It's a society which is hit by a social, economic, moral, humanitarian crisis. Moral, because the basic human rights are not being respected. Political, because there's no democracy, no rule of law, no separation of powers, no freedom of expression, hundreds of political prisoners. A political crisis, because Venezuela, and economic, because it was once the richest country in Latin America, and today it has less than half of the productive capacity as it did at the height of its economy. Venezuela is a country which is experiencing a tragedy at this time. Its people are fleeing from precarious conditions of existence. Many, too many Venezuelans are literally losing their lives. They're dying for a lack of food and medicine. And President Maduro denies the situation, does not open the doors to humanitarian aid, which many countries are prepared to provide, such as mine. In the last 4 years, more than 2 million Venezuelans have had to abandon their country due to crises I just mentioned. And I have to ask myself, how can it be that a president who is so ambitious, how can he be so insensitive so as to inflict pain and suffering on his own people in order to hang on to the power? But Venezuela is not the only country in that situation. There are other countries, such as Nicaragua. More than 400 people have died with the violence created by the state and by the government of President Ortega. Indeed, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights reported on assassinations, extrajudicial executions, ill treatment, torture, and arbitrary detentions, but was expelled from Nicaragua a month ago. In Cuba, something similar is happening. There, more than 60 years have elapsed without freedom, democracy, or basic respect for human rights. There are arbitrary detentions, and as in Nicaragua and Venezuela, there's been censorship of the right to freedom of expression, which is guaranteed under Article 19 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights of these United Nations. Chile did not recognize the legitimacy of the recent presidential elections in Venezuela because they did not meet the minimum necessary requirements for the elections to be considered free, democratic, and transparent in accordance with international standards. And therefore, Chile will not recognize the legitimacy of the new government that is emerging from those elections. And we will always do everything that we can within the context of international law to help the Venezuelan people to recover their liberties, their democracy, and the respect for human rights, and to emerge from this sad tragedy impacting their country. But to that end, we need the support of the multilateral system, and especially of the United Nations. We believe it's necessary for this organization, through the Security Council, to address the democratic crisis and humanitarian crises that are affecting these countries. I said it before, in the modern time, liberty, democracy, and the respect of human rights should not have to recognize any borders, should know no borders, which is why we are using all mechanisms allowed to promote international law and to cooperate with full force of the strength of our convictions and commitment to promote liberty, democracy, and human rights in these countries. The United Nations, and I'd like to conclude my remarks with a thought. The United Nations in its current form, with the modernizations and reforms that many countries believe are required for the United Nations, and urgently, the United Nations, which has contributed on countless occasions to the maintenance of international peace and security, as the cornerstone of multilateralism, the United Nations today sees their purview very restricted and limited. We have lost the ability to prevent a crisis and to strengthen the institutions of member states with the aim of generating true democratic resilience, a culture of democratic resilience, capable of surviving a break like the one experienced in some countries in our region. And that's why we believe the time has come for this organization, the United Nations, to modernize, like put forth so many times, so many member states, so that the United Nations can then act more quickly and more efficiently to tackle the challenges of our modern times. The structure of the United Nations, and especially of its Security Council, is a legacy of the victors of the Second World War that ended now more than 70 years ago, and which no longer responds to the needs and challenges of our times. In fact, we all know that any of the permanent members of the Security Council can exercise or threaten to exercise their right to veto based more on their own interests or those of their allies than on their duty to preserve peace and security in all corners of our planet. This behavior is reducing the effectiveness of an organization that concentrates so much of its power and responsibilities, tremendous responsibilities, such as the Security Council of the United Nations. Moreover, the current composition of the Security Council does not reflect the modern world and is not representative of entire continents such as Africa or Latin America or countries such as Germany, India, and Japan, and the weight that they bear in our global world. Before concluding, I'd like to emphasize how important it is for development not only to be sustainable, but also for peace to be sustainable. And it is precisely at times like these where the values we share as an international community should guide and illuminate our actions. The peoples must not only be united by free markets and free trade. It is the preservation of peace and security and the preservation of fundamental freedoms which led to the organization's creation. And that is what we must shed light on. It's these values that should light our way in the future. Only by strengthening and reviving these values will the United Nations be able to fulfill its responsibilities and meet the challenges of this new world in which we live today. Because together with the formidable threats such as terrorism, global warming, and massive migrations, we also have magnificent opportunities before us, created by freedom, imagination, and creativity, without limits, of men and women free in this world. Thank you.
Au nom de l'Assemblée Générale.
On behalf of the General Assembly, I wish to thank the President of the Republic of Chile for the statements just made. May I request representatives to remain seated while we bid farewell to the Head of State.